Hey everybody, this is Maxine Taylor with another edition of Move into the Magic, and I am so excited to be able to share my guest with you today. Some of you know her. Dr. Pat Gibson is an incredibly well-known chiropractor here in the Atlanta area. She is known for being ahead of her time in chiropractic, way before other chiropractors were dealing with mind, body, and spirit. Pat Gibson was dealing with mind, body, and spirit. And what she does is she doesn't just adjust her patients. She just doesn't make them feel better. She aims for total wellness. And with that in mind, she's written a book that you're going to want to get hold of. It's on Amazon right now, and it's just a fabulous book. It's called Living in Your Sweet Spot. I know you want to know about that. So, without further ado, my friend Pat Gibson, who I have known for about 25 years. Pat, welcome to Move into the Magic.
Thanks, Max. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, honey. Now, this book that you have written is, well, once I started it, I couldn't stop. First of all, tell us why you wrote it. And tell us about the title.
Okay, why I wrote it. Well, I think basically we're all sort of moving further away from or closer to our authentic self. Yeah. And I think we have a whole lot of mischief that we put in the way to either deny, avoid, anything we can do to keep from getting there. And sometimes that mischief is a little tricky. So I wrote the book to outline kind of systematically from a spirit, mind, body place all of the reasons that we do to do that. In terms of how did I get the title, that's a pretty good story. I started taking Wednesday afternoons off to allow myself some time to write the book. And, you know, I'm pretty diligent and responsible. So when I take that time off and I'm taking time out of income and stuff, I felt like it was really important to actually use it. But one day I came home and, you know, it was my time to write and sit down, and it was the last thing in the world I wanted to do. So I started doing bargaining with myself, like, okay, if I ride my bike, I could think about the book while I'm riding, and that will actually be like working, but it won't be, you know, really hard. So off I go, and as you know, Atlanta has this incredibly beautiful belt line, which is where railway stations used to be, and it's beautiful, it's well maintained, and on a Wednesday afternoon, absolutely nobody is on it. And on this particular day, it was like 75, sunny, light breeze. I was feeling really good. And as I was riding down on the belt line, I thought, you know what? This is like living in your sweet spot. This is as good as it gets. And then as I wrote a little bit further, it was like, oh, you know what? That is exactly what I'm talking about in the book. And that's really how the name came. So in essence, it wasn't a wasted day. You know, I really came up with the title of the book. You know, that brings up a good point. It's one of the things I talk about in the book is that when you're stuck, getting out and moving really will move that energy. And it wasn't so much that I was stuck. I just really didn't want to do it. And so moving that energy that day brought me to the place of coming up with the title.
What a great story. So many people would beat themselves up for not sitting down and writing because they said they would. And isn't it just incredibly beautiful the way spirit works and the way it's all good, it all works out exactly as it's supposed to.
Exactly. And, you know, that's that whole first chapter that you were talking to me about earlier about learning how to follow the thread. It's like, you know, if we can look at calming ourselves down and being able to listen to the messages that Spirit gives us, it's there. You just have to look for it.
You've got to talk about that. Because if I remember correctly, and you correct me if I'm talking about a different chapter, but wasn't that the chapter in which you described how you adopted your beautiful daughter?
Yeah, it is the chapter. In that chapter, what I'm trying to do is to get people to know that spirit or God or whatever you call that thing, your higher self, is constantly giving you messages. And when you can learn how to listen to them, it really leads you to your authentic self. And in that chapter, I give the story basically of how I got my daughter. And I start out talking about how when I was in Utah one time, a bunch of us were going skiing, and we had a whiteout day. And so instead of going skiing, we opted for spas and breakfast and so on. And we saw this person, and you know, it was in this bookstore where the breakfast was associated with bookstore, so we could walk around and kind of meander and stuff. And this woman set up a card table, and out of the corner of my eye, she was doing palm readings. And so all of us took a turn having our palms read. And you know, now, let's put it in context. I was like in my 20s, so after we all had our palms read and we were guffawing around the table saying what our fortunes were going to be, and I was like, I'll go one better. Look, right here, I'm going to have a kid. It says so. And everybody just burst into laughter. And I was thinking to myself at the time, well, it's funny, but it's not that funny. And then a little while later, my brother and sister got kids, and I loved it. But, you know, I kept telling myself the same old story of I'm really busy. I'm a very hectic life. I could never have a kid of my own. It's great that I just get to be Aunt Pat. Then my best friends went to China and adopted a child. And it was great because I got to be Aunt Pat closer. And I noticed that something was stirring in my heart again. And long story short, I started to feel sad one Mother's Day that I was over at their house. And sadness isn't something that really comes easy to me, you know. So when sadness is happening, it gets my attention, and I'm like, what is this about? So I started entertaining a whole bunch of thoughts, and you know, by the end of it, the last thought that I never thought would show up was, oh, maybe I am sad because I'm not a mother myself. And it was like a 2x4 hit me in the head, and it was like, oh God. So I started to explore that, and then finally, and decided I was going to adopt a child. But then Spirit threw a whole lot of stuff in my way to make sure that that was absolutely true. One of my favorite stories to tell about that, though, is how I kept, you know, I said to the universe, I want a clear sign. I don't want any woo-woo puff of smoke. I want something that is so clear that I know that this is the right thing for me and the right thing for this child. And so I let it go. And then I went to the High Museum for an auction. And it was one of those kind of high-end auctions, you know, where you really pay your money and you don't really expect to win anything. The trips were like, I mean, the prizes were like trips and spa vacations and stuff like that. So I paid my money, milled around with everybody, and then I started to leave. And I was out in the hall, and I caught up with a friend of mine, and we were chit-chatting. And then all of a sudden, I hear my name over the loudspeaker. And I run back into the thing thinking, woohoo, spa vacation. And I go up on the, the podium thing there, and they hand me this big envelope. And I'm thinking, this is a very large coupon for a spa vacation. But I go back out in the hall, and I sit down on the little black benches out there, and I pull out the thing. And it's a watercolor. And it's a watercolor, and it is done by a Chinese artist, and it has his little, red chalk block signature in the corner. And it is literally a stork in a flag. And I just burst into tears because I knew in that moment that Spirit had given me my answer.
Mm.
And so, it just evolved into that. And then there were so many other things like, you have to do what's called a dossier, where you basically have 17 documents that you have to accumulate to, I should tell you this before I tell you that. So I decided to adopt from China too. And
oh yeah, by the way.
And so I used the same agency that my friends had used, and they send you this big document that you have to prepare, and it's 17 things. And I had gotten my packet, if you will, on a Tuesday, and I didn't really even open it because I knew what it was. I know it takes like 6 to 8 months, 12 months to get it all together, and so I didn't even open it. And so the woman called me, and she said that day, and said, well, I've got some sad news. China's changed the rules, and you're not going to be able to adopt from China because they're only going to basically take one baby a year with single women, and there's a lot of people in front of you. And I was like stunned. I was like, how could this happen? I had so many signs, symptoms, signals, followed the thread. What up? This is not right. So she said, have you considered any other countries? And I said, well, she said, you have to have everything in by Friday. And that will be obviously logistically impossible. And so she said, have you considered any other countries? And I said, well, it's not Friday yet. And she said, with all due respect, Dr. Gibson, I know you're upset, but I'll call you on Monday when you've had some time to think about this next week, and we'll talk again. So I did what I do when I get upset. I got in the bathtub, poured myself a glass of wine, had a little hissy fit, and realized in that moment that I didn't have a lot of time. Document to prepare. So I got up and I started going through what I could do that night. One of the things you had to do was make a picture of your house and where the child would sleep and your dog and all that stuff. So I'd set up my camera, get at the piano, take pictures. I was free to flash all over the house. And then I went to the CVS and printed them out. And then I went to the 24-hour place up the street and made the book. Okay, book, check, done. On the way, I called my friends and said, I need 3 letters of recommendation. I mean, you cannot imagine how many things had to be done. Everything from FBI clearance to local police clearance, et cetera, et cetera. And there were many fun stories, which you can read about in that chapter, that happened throughout that whole time. But in the end, I had all 17 documents. And I hired a person to take them to the state. After you do all these things, you have to have them notarized, and then the notary has to be authenticated. Then it has to go to the state and get a state seal. Thank God we live here. So I hired a runner to take it down to the state and anxiously waited for her to come back. And she came back and she had them. She walks in the office, gives me the thumbs up. But then I had to get them to the people. So I took them to the mailboxes, et cetera, that was really close to my office. And I had all 17 documents piled high. I take them and I push them across the counter. I'm totally wasted. And I say to this woman, I need these documents to go to this address in the safest, fastest way possible. And I'll never forget this. This woman reaches across the counter, takes my hands, and says, I've adopted 3. I'll take good care of them. And you know, if you've adopted, you really do know what they look like because they're very distinguished. I mean, they have a blue seal. It's you can't miss it if you know what they are. And so, right up to the moment of that, Spirit was taking care of me and leading me. So
that story just was. It was such a beautiful example of how we are guided if we'll just allow ourselves to trust. And we have signs, as you said, everywhere. And years ago, I came across a quote that said, God hasn't carried me this far to drop me now.
Absolutely.
And that's what you were talking about in that chapter. Of course, now we would say spirit, but it's the same thing.
Right, absolutely.
And I think that type of story, the examples that you give through the book, are so powerful and so wonderful because I learn from stories. I mean, as a child, we said, tell me a story. And the thing I love about your book is that it is filled with stories, examples of your patients, of your friends, and all that they have accomplished. And I think it's because they were under your tutelage. I'm not trying to say it was, that you were the only one, but you were their guide. And what you share in this book is the culmination of years of study on your part, years of experience. You give workshops as well, don't you, Pat?
Yeah, I do, and I tell a lot of stories in my workshop too. I think people learn from stories, and storytelling enters in a way in our brain that doesn't get there by facts and figures. Now, I give a lot of facts and figures throughout the book, and I talk a little bit of science. I mean, that's part of me. I'm kind of geeky and goobery that way. But I really think that when you tell stories, it takes that information and drives it home, you know, in a way that it gets in your brain in a way it wouldn't have otherwise.
I agree with you because you can identify, I can identify with what you're saying. Let me ask you this. I know when I've written my books, they've been eye-opening and cathartic. I learned more as a writer than as a reader. Did you have any surprises when you were writing this beautiful book?
I can speak to two parts to that question. Yes, I absolutely had surprises, and the biggest surprise I'd have to say was that I wrote the book in the first place. I'm not one of those people who always thought I had a book in me, and when I retire, when I get enough time, I'm going to do it. It was much more of an internal street fight. You know, part of me knew that it was the right thing to do, and I was being led to do it. And the other part of me was like, no way, Jose, I am just way too busy. So the biggest surprise I would have to say is that it got written in the first place. What was the other part of your question that you just asked me?
As you were writing it, what other surprises did you personally experience?
Okay. The other thing that triggered me was after I had written the book, and this is why I thought about this when you said this earlier, people would say to me, aren't you excited? Aren't you thrilled? Doesn't this make you so happy? Blah, 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 blah. And I felt kind of bad because I really wasn't that excited in the way that I felt like they wanted me to be. And I was out to dinner with a friend and we were talking about it. And what I realized is that this thing was really about the journey. I learned so much about myself, I learned a lot of cool stuff in doing the research too. But the biggest thing was what I learned about myself and my own vulnerabilities and my own mischief and things like that, all of which went into the book. And so, the surprise was that I wasn't really that excited to be done. It's cool and all. I'm really excited I did it. But I wasn't like on this high and this thrill and like a lot of people expected me to be.
Yes, I think that writing a book is like preparing to birth a baby. It's not, oh, whoop-de-doo. It's a deep journey and incredibly cathartic. When you come out on the other side, the experience is different for everyone. Usually a certain amount of relief, excuse me, that the baby is finally born, and then you start the next part of the journey with the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Were there any things that you wrote about that you didn't expect to write about?
That's a good question. Well, I can answer it sort of backwards. And that is to say there was something that I forgot to write about that I didn't expect. And the way that happened is I got done with the book and one of my patients was talking to me about it. And just out of the clear blue sky, she said, is there anything that you left out of the book? And I said, well, that's an odd question, but no, I don't think so. And you know how when you got that thing kind of back of your head, it keeps gnawing at you. So I was driving home later that day and I thought, well, is there anything I forgot? I was like, no, I think it's good. Next day in the shower, did you forget something? I might have forgotten something. So I started thinking about what could I have possibly forgotten. I started thinking about it, and sort of just let it go. And then as spirit would have it, I went to a 50th birthday party, and it was a surprise, and it was at a restaurant. Somebody walked in with this whole big bouquet of silver mylar and white balloons, and in the middle of all those balloons was this huge balloon heart that said love. And I was like, oh my God, I forgot love. How could I have forgotten love? Because love is so critical to becoming your authentic self. And it's one of those things where, I didn't know what to do at that point. The book was done. I had already signed off on the last edits. Did I stop production and go back and write that chapter? Did I leave it out? But it was one of those things where it's sort of like practicing what I preach. I made a mistake. I don't know where Spirit's leading me with that. I don't know whether it goes in the next book. I don't know whether I'll write a book by itself. I don't know, whether it was just to make a mistake and be human, and to use that as a teachable moment. But I definitely forgot love, and I think love is really critical to becoming your authentic self, whether that's loving yourself or loving your enemies or loving your neighbors or mankind or what have you. So that was something that was sort of a surprise. Like, how could I forget love? But I did.
Well, Pat, I have to say that in reading your book, I felt the love. You didn't need to do a chapter on it per se, because I think the reader will feel the love right from the get-go, right from that first chapter on following the thread, because you're very open in the book, you're very vulnerable, and that first chapter talks about the greatest love that you have been able to create in your own life, short of you creating your life. And that is to adopt your beautiful daughter. So I think the love is the foundation. It's on every single page.
Well, thanks for saying that, and I really appreciate that, because hopefully that is what I tried to, to put in it. But to forget a chapter on love and authentic self was like, whoops. But
you can pick up where you left off next time.
Maybe I will, yeah. But you mentioned vulnerability. That was really big and huge for me in the book, was to be vulnerable. And it's not something I'm really comfortable with. I'd have to say for most of my life, vulnerability has been my growth edge. And the book really cranked that up a lot, because there's a lot of me in the book. And there, when you mentioned there's patience in the book, there really isn't patience that are actually mine. I took stories from people. Like, you can't read that book and go, oh, that was me, because the sexes are changed, the jobs are changed, the people are changed. So if you're a patient and you're reading that book, don't look to find yourself, because you will not ever be able to identify yourself.
Well, but let me throw this out to you. When I wrote my book, Move Into the Magic, I disguised everything. I switched sexes and changed names and combined people into one new person. Right. But what I found is that when people read it, and I'm sure this is what's going to happen with what is happening with your book too, you speak from the heart, you speak to the heart, you address issues that we can all identify with. And so people, when they read my book, said, that's my story. How did you know my story? Well, I didn't. But because so many of these stories are universally true, people think that I've written about them, and they'll think that you've written about them too. So here you've made your disclaimer.
Yeah, but that's actually true. I think these stories are universal. Problems are universal. Issues that we have are universal. And that's why everybody can look at that and say, oh, there's a piece of me. And that's one of the things that I hope to do with the book, is for somebody to read through the particular chapters that pertain to them, or, the whole book's worth a read, but some things are more important to people than others, and just say, there might be some truth to that. In that trigger is where the things start to happen. It all gets rolling and Spirit starts giving you those messages.
Well, you know what let's do now? Let's talk about some of those chapters in the book. The first one is such a grabber. You've described it so beautifully just a few minutes ago. But I've got to tell you, and my audience, I mentioned this when I introduced you. Pat and I have known each other for about 25 years, and we've been through the spiritual journey together at various times. Pat, many years ago, we were sitting in a group, in a class, and I was upset about a person. And you said to me something I'll never forget. It was so profound. And you have a chapter in your book on forgiveness, which is vital to being your authentic self. And what you said to me was, why are you angry at him for doing what you invited him to do, for treating you the way you invited him to treat you. And I've never forgotten that, because that's exactly the truth. So I guess with that, won't you share a little bit about your chapter on forgiveness?
Well, I think forgiveness is critical for so many reasons, whether you need to forgive somebody else or you need to forgive yourself. That's the biggest person that we often forget in the equation. But what I think a lot of people don't really get about forgiveness is that you forgive for you. And actually, I just did a meditation that I put on my website about forgiveness, about this very thing. And that is that it's like, I think people get you twice when you don't forgive them, because first of all, you're walking around with all the irritability and anger and rehearsing it over and over in your head, and all the things you should have said and would have said and wished you'd said and wished you were bright enough to say in that moment, and etc. I mean, how many of us have done that in our lives? How much energy does that take? So first of all, they get you by whatever offending agent that they gave you, and secondly, they get you because you're walking around giving them so much energy the second time. So when you forgive, you really forgive for you. Whatever that person did, they're going to have to live with. And I can't even remember who that person was, but thank you for saying it was valuable to you. But I had an experience where somebody sort of did me wrong, and I'm sort of a sensitive soul. And in doing that, what happened is I found myself, really not wanting to be fooled again in that way. And so what it did is make me more cautious about everything. So I started questioning, like, whether a delivery would be on time, or whether the plane would be on time, or whether this would go right, or this, started to question everything. And it was because this forgiveness I wasn't able to do because I didn't want to be had again, so to speak. And once I started I was laying in bed one morning, and I was going through a whole lot of what I just said about, will this happen or will that happen? And I realized, wow, when did I get this way? This sucks. And so I started tracing it back and back and back. And what I realized is it happened with this particular person who had offended me. And I was like, wow, that is amazing how much energy, how much of my life that has consumed. And then really started to practice what I preach, and that is forgive for you, so that your energy is not continually affected by the person who offended you.
That's the truth. That's the truth. And I think when you take full and complete responsibility for having invited that treatment, and that was what you pointed out, oh, Pat, got to be 20 years ago.
Yeah.
That was an aha moment for me that was huge, because that is my credo now. If you're not taking full and complete responsibility for your life, you're upset, you're carrying hurt, you're blaming them. They're not to blame. You invited that, you created that. And that, to me, I have to keep giving you credit for that, because it was life-changing for me.
I think it's even cooler when you can take it one step further and look at the why of the creation.
Yes.
And say, okay, so yeah, I created this person doing this thing to me. What's the value? And it's not to be hurt, I can assure you. In my particular case, it was, again, a vulnerability growth point. And being able to take that piece of the offending agent, if you will, and not just forgive them, but to use it and come full circle and say, okay, what was the gift here? And it is a gift. It's definitely a gift.
Yes.
And if you don't unwrap the package, you're going to keep getting the same gift until you get the gift.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what I came to see in my own personal evolution, which started when you said that in that room, that there is a gift in everything. And if you just go back to childhood, see where it started and say, it's over. That was then, this is now. You can eliminate that situation and learn to love, which is what we were talking about earlier.
You bring up a really good point. When you do that and you take it full circle, like I I really, here we are, what, 25, 30 years later, I would have never, ever known that I said that to you or made an impact on you. But when you're really living authentically and being yourself, you touch people's lives. You know, everything that we say is energy. Everything that we do is energy. And being mindful of that energy and knowing and taking responsibility, hey, we're affecting people, whether we like it or not. You know, being really mad at the person in front of you when you're driving, or all of the things that we do, whether they're kindnesses and smiling at somebody who looks like they're having a bad day, they make a difference. And when you're living your authentic life, you're making a difference.
I agree with you. And to me, that's so thrilling. And the ripples that go out there, you don't even perhaps know what you've done, but that ripple flows, and then that person is able to pay it forward, so to speak.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I will never forget this. And, you know, this got embedded in my brain by a story that somebody told me a long time ago. And it was about this guy who was on a train, and he had a bunch of kids, and like 4 or 5 kids. And the kids are running all over the train, and the guy's just sitting in his chair, and he's very lethargic, and he's got his head down, and he's not paying attention to his kids. And this woman is getting more and more and more pissed off. And finally she gets so pissed off, she gets up and she shakes the guy and she says, "Why don't you control your children?" And the guy looks up at her and he says, "I'm sorry, what?" And she said, "Why are you controlling your children?" He said, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I just lost my wife." And in that moment, you know, you really get like, you have no idea what's going on in people's lives. You have no idea why things are happening.
Yes.
But if you come from your highest and best place and just assume the best instead of the worst,
Yes.
and recognize you're getting triggered for a reason that has nothing to do with that guy, it's your stuff. You see, and that moment was really a critical turning point for me in really getting that in a profound way.
Oh, what a great story. What a great story. Well, I think those types of stories are what make your book so great, because the information in it is, I mean, if you just put information, it's information, but the way you illustrate it is what I love. And what I would love you to do is, I have my favorite chapters. Just by looking at the titles, I've got my favorite chapters, and everybody else will have their favorite chapters. Do you have any that you particularly think are important, or that you just love above and beyond because of the message that they share?
I think my favorite chapter is Following the Thread, because it's about my daughter. It's so much to my heart. But I think all the chapters are going to speak to people differently. That just happens to be my favorite chapter because it's about me, and it's about my daughter, and it's about my evolution, and so on. So, and I wrote it so much from the heart. It was a difficult chapter to write, but it was the easiest chapter to write.
Oh, that's beautiful.
It was difficult because I kept reliving the moments as I was writing them, and they made me cry, and they made me remember, and, you know. But there are other chapters that are going to appeal to people differently because, for example, they may not be living their destiny, or they may read about this person who was a lawyer, and because their whole families were lawyer, and, you know, they wanted to paint, and why they didn't paint, and how they got to that. And, you know, all the stories we tell ourselves about why we can't do something. So that chapter may appeal to them. Some other person may not be willing to forgive their parents, you know, and stay stuck in their whole story. And that's what keeps them from becoming their authentic self. Somebody else might look at it and say, I don't need to look at the stuff about food because I am impeccable. And, you know, so kind of the way I look at it is, it's going to appeal to different pieces of you, and different people are going to be drawn to certain parts of the book because of what's going on in their life. Like if you live in a to die for a buff body, but you hate your job, then sure, the destiny and following your thread's going to be a little more important. But if you are living your destiny and loving what you're doing, but you have no time for your friends or family or meditation or any fun, then some of the other chapters are going to be more appealing to you. So to answer your question directly, I think following the thread was mine, but as people go through it, they're going to look and see the pieces that really just apply to themselves.
I think that's a beautiful answer, and I think it's true. There is one chapter that I would love you to talk about because it's very dear to my heart, and that is the chapter on finding your destiny. You mentioned it a minute ago. I can't think of anything more important at this phase of our evolution, and it's a broad brush stroke, than knowing your destiny. I call it your mission. Would you address that?
Yeah, I would. And it's funny you use the word mission, because in the first part of the chapter, I talk about when I'm a little girl, and you know how all of us get asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to be when you grow up? And my mother asked me that question one day, and I said, I was like 3 or 4, and I said, I'm not sure, but I know I'm here on a mission. And for years, I was chided about that. And what I have come to see is that mission is your destiny. And in the chapter, I talk, and again, giving stories about how many creative ways we can find to not live our destiny.
Yes.
And all of the stories that we can come up with that seemingly are very true on the surface, but underneath the scaffolding doesn't hold up about why we can't do the thing we want to do. And I did talk about, I give many stories, but I'll give you just 2. One was a woman who did come from a long line of lawyers, and her dad's a lawyer, her brother was a lawyer, her uncles are lawyers. It's what she grew up with. She's comfortable with it. Her dad had the largest law firm in town. So when people would say to her, what do you want to be when you grow up? She would say, I don't know. And when it came time to actually go to school, even though her parents would support her in doing anything she wanted to do, she was not attached to, they didn't tell her you have to be a lawyer. They said, be whatever you want to be. But underneath, she believed in her consciousness that they really did want her to be a lawyer, and that was the way that would make them happy. And it seemed like a no-brainer to her because she could just go to school and come out and have a practice. And, it just made sense. Make the parents happy, make some money, all will be well in the universe. Well, she did go on to be a lawyer, and she was a really good lawyer. And she did okay, but it certainly didn't fulfill her passion. She liked all the kudos she would get from doing a good job, but really didn't satisfy her soul. So she started painting just as a relief, as a stress relief, because as you know, law can be kind of stressful. And what she found is that she just was so incredibly passionate about painting. And long story short, and you can read about it, the long part in the book, she started taking a day a week to paint. And then she found like she really wanted to do more painting and less lawyering. And that, at this point, was getting her father a little annoyed because he's like, what's up? Be one or the other. Don't be both. You can't be both. So eventually she did start painting, and her stuff went in galleries, and over a few years now she does painting full time. But she had to go through this whole thing about, and many of you will go through this as you challenge yourself in finding your destiny, but I have this $150,000 education. How can I possibly waste that? It's not waste. You will take every bit of that information, as she did as a lawyer, and use it to do her passion as painting. It's all part of the process. It's all part of what you bring to the table. The only problem is when you stop the destiny and you don't go for it. Another person, and this I do know this person very well, she won't know it because it's a he, but she loved to draw as a kid, and she was allowed to draw and paint. So it wasn't a problem in terms of her being able to paint. She just couldn't actually ever get it out there. She painted prolifically, but she would never let anybody see it. And so finally she got the courage to do a show in a gallery. And so she was making a whole new set of paintings that was going to be just for the gallery, and she needed like 3 more. And so one of her friends let her use the beach house that they had so she could go crank it out for a week. She took her dog and she went there. And the first day she got there, she walked in and she was like, wow, that was a long drive. I think I'll just chill out. And then the next day she thought, I'm tireder than I thought. Maybe if I just rest for a day, take care of myself for today, then I'll be better and I'll go quicker when I start it the next day. So she did. She took a whole day and chilled out, walked on the beach, took her dog, laid in the sun, ate great food, really took good care of herself. And the next day she woke up and she thought, maybe I need another day. And so she was laying at the pool and she was getting a suntan. And you know how we kind of drift off when you're at the pool, when you're getting a tan. And when she was laying there, she had sort of a flashback, if you will, or remembering. She was about 8 years old, and she was so excited to show everybody her paintings that she had done. And she took all of her paintings and took string and took it all across her room and hung the pictures with tape on the string. And her father walked by the room, and he saw the mess she had created, and he said, what the hell are you doing? Get that shit off the wall, and be careful when you take down the tape that it doesn't pull off the paint. And in that moment, she took all of her paintings and smushed them up and put them in the basket. And it wasn't until that moment of really getting quiet, calming her brain down, being able to listen to herself and listen to spirit, that she realized that that was the reason she couldn't paint and couldn't finish. Because here she was, her 8-year-old was the person who was going to put up the paintings in that gallery, not her current self. And so she had to, get quiet and deal with that to be able to go on and achieve her destiny, and I'm happy to say she did. So those are the kinds of things that I talk about in the Destiny chapter. And it's really all the mischief and all the stories and all the things that we put in our way to keep us from living our own authentic life. And I also talk about myself in there. I certainly have put many things in my way to get to what I'm doing now. And I'm loving what I'm doing now. I'm speaking a lot, and I'm doing workshops, and, the book certainly, and I love my practice still, but I also put a lot of things in my way before I got to here.
Well, where do you see yourself going then in the future? I don't mean 20 years from now, but I mean, okay, you have a successful book, and it's successful, even though it just came out, because it is a joy to read, and people love the book. I know they love the book. So that's done.
Yeah, the feedback's been really pretty good so far. I'm happy with the book. It's been good.
So now what?
I don't really know that there's a now what yet. Right now, I'm very content. I'm happy doing what I'm doing. I'd like to probably speak a little bit more. And I've allowed time in my schedule to do that, and maybe do a few more workshops than I've been doing, and probably write a little bit more. But, I haven't, that part of the thread hasn't shown up on the tapestry yet. So I don't exactly know yet. It's, it's evolving.
It is.
But I'm happy doing what I'm doing. So I don't know if there'll be something different. Maybe just more of the same.
And on a higher and higher level, and more. Because I think what's going to happen is people are going to give you their stories. Mm-hmm. After they read the book, they're going to contact you. By the way, how can people contact you, Pat? What's your website?
My website is www.gibsonchiropracticclinic.com. And if you go to my website, there's a place that says contact, and that, when you hit that email, that actually comes directly to me. And so it doesn't go to my staff. That email will come directly to me. So if you really want to tell me something, you want more information, you want whatever, that's the best way to get me.
Now, there's one chapter that I would love to, we have a little more time left, and I want you to please, if you would, share the chapter in your book, and let me give the name of the book again so that people are aware of it. Living in Your Sweet Spot. Love that title. You know the chapter. When I tell you which chapter it is, you're going to laugh. But it's the chapter I'm being able to say, I want.
Oh my God, that is so critical. And that's why I put it in there. I'll tell you, after I started doing workshops a couple years ago, people would contact me and say, well, I really love that information, but I'm having a really hard time figuring out what I want. And at first I thought, well, how would I know what they want? You know what I mean? It's like, how would they know what I want? Do you know what I mean? So it kept happening over and over so often that I thought, you know what, I really need to talk about this. This is actually an issue. So when I started putting it together, I realized there are so many reasons that people are not free to say I want. Whether it's because you will be obligated if you say I want. Sometimes it's because you've been taught that saying I want is selfish. Like, I don't know if any of you heard some of the things that I heard when I grew up, which is like, the world does not revolve around you. It isn't always what you want. Who do you think you are? Why do you think your needs are more important than another? And, you know, in and of themselves, some of those things are true, but it's also true that you need to be able to say I want, because how can you go on and fill your destiny if you can't say I want to be a fireman, or I want to be a musician, or I want to be a writer, or whatever it is that you want to be. I also talk about a funny story in there about how people expect you to already know what it is that they want and give it to you ahead of time without you even asking. And I tell a funny story, and this is a true story, about how a husband was sitting having dinner with his wife, and he's all irritable and huffy, and his wife is saying to him, what is it? What are you mad about? What's wrong? And he's like, nothing. And he starts huffing and puffing and moving his food around on his plate, and she's like, well, clearly something's wrong with you. What is wrong? And in that moment, he stands up in his chair and he reaches across the table and he grabs the salt and he bangs it down and says, if you'd have loved me, you would have known I wanted the salt. And it's a silly story, but it really depicts how much people expect you to already know what they want and give it to you. And so for those people also, it avoids them ever having to say I want, they expect you should already know, and then they just get annoyed when they don't get it. So that whole chapter is devoted to all of the different ways that we can't say I want, and why we need to learn how to say I want.
Very powerful. And I think another chapter that I think is so important, and I know there are two. In the time we have left, let's see if we can cover both of them. Compassion. The older I get, the more loving I get, the more compassionate I become, the more sensitive I become to other people. And I'm very grateful for that. And gratitude for what I've got. It just increases what I've got. Will you address those two?
Okay, let's start with gratitude. Gratitude will change your life. Gratitude will change your energy. Gratitude changes everything. You may probably already be aware about how many times people say, write down 3 things every night before you go to bed that you're grateful for.
Yes.
It really does change the way you go to bed. I had a really exciting and cool thing that happened to me with gratitude. I was driving to work a couple of years ago, and it was coming on my 55th birthday. And I thought, I don't really do much for birthdays, but the big ones I usually kind of celebrate. So I decided that I would get 55 people. And this started with my cousin Larry. When we were growing up, he's an astronaut now, but when we were growing up, he would give people presents for his birthday. because he was grateful for them being in his life.
Yeah.
And I never forgot that. And so for my 55th birthday, what I decided is I would get 55 people to do acts of gratitude. And they could do it for anybody they wanted. They could tell me or not. And the response was absolutely amazing. Like in one day, I had 55 people. And then I thought, well, heck, why not go big? And I decided, let's do 155 people. And I did, and it was next year. I mean, I got hundreds of people, and I would even have people who called me and said, I heard you were doing this thing, and I just wanted to let you know I'm doing it too, and this is what I did. And the amazing things that happened with that gratitude were just unbelievable. One woman, she would, and she still to this day does it. She takes $100 every month, and it's a $100 bill, and she just keeps it in her purse until she decides what to do with it. Sometimes she gives it to people without them expecting it. Sometimes she'll say, if I give you $100, will you do something nice for yourself or your wife or your kids? But she still to this day does it. And the things that people did were amazing. Like one person paid for 55 people in the toll booth on 400. And the woman said that she loves when people do that because she loves seeing their faces of the people as they drive up, and she said, somebody paid for you already. She said it's the best part of her day when that happens. So gratitude changes energy. It changes your life. It will change the lives of the people around you. So I cannot say enough good things about gratitude. Read the chapter on gratitude. Be grateful. Be grateful for everything you have, for every lesson that comes your way, every gift that needs to be unwrapped. Gratitude changes lives. Compassion. I think you mentioned a really good point. As you age, we get more compassionate. We really begin to realize that the little things don't matter anymore. It's really the big things. And when you learn that more and more, you get compassionate for those around you. And in doing that, you eventually get to be really compassionate for yourself. And when you get to the place where you're really compassionate for yourself, that's when life changes.
I think that's very true. And what I've seen that thrills me the most is doing my mission, my purpose, my destiny to help this planet. And I found that many, many people have reached that point too. I don't think you can do universally helping others until you really appreciate you. And I think your book, Living in Your Sweet Spot, helps people to love themselves, to have gratitude for what they have. It helps them be who they really are. And when you come from that point, then you can reach out to everybody. And I think in your book, you speak on many different levels, and you speak to people who are on different levels. And that's the power, I think, of living in your sweet spot.
I think, we're kind of hardwired for mastery. And I think that's one of the things that keeps us from having compassion for ourselves, is that I didn't get it right the first time. Let me try it again. I can't let that go because I did it wrong. And it's this mastery that we're hardwired for, I think, that often gets in the way of being able to be compassionate for ourselves.
I agree. I think perfection is the hardest, one of the hardest hurdles to overcome, because who are you perfect for?
And it's so nebulous. It's a moving target. Being perfect for your parents, perfect for your patients, perfect for your lovers, perfect for your kids. It's nebulous. It's a moving target.
It is. And and I think that when you get that you are great, just like you are, that your spirit in an earthbound body, there is nothing wrong with you. One of my workshops is called "There's Nothing Wrong with You, Deal with It," because there's nothing wrong with us. Just all the baggage that we've carried. And I really feel, Pat, that your book is going to make a huge difference in people's lives by helping them see, not just, baggage is, in quotes, but get those aha moments that turn their life around because you've used those moments as your examples.
Well, that's really what I want. And, you know, for me, I already feel successful because I had a kid read my book. You know, I had a lot of people read the book, as I'm sure you did. And that kid read the first chapter on following the thread, and she'd been pretty estranged from her family and for years. And she left the house that night and went and reconnected with her family. So for me, I'm done. I feel successful. You know, changing one life is all it takes. And so thank you for saying that, because that's all I really want. By the way, you know, you talked about people wanting to contact me. The other thing you can do is if you go to the website and sign up for my newsletter, I always send out something every month about all of this kind of stuff. And so if you want to stay connected that way, it's everything from something spiritual to, you know, why you need to drink more water. So that's another way to stay in contact with me and get that information.
Excellent, excellent. Pat, thank you so much for being my guest today. It's been great reconnecting with you, and I hope everybody out there has enjoyed meeting Dr. Pat Gibson, and that you'll race out there to Amazon and get her book, Living in Your Sweet Spot.
Thank you so much for having me, Max. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
It's a pleasure.
And I hope that all of you will join me next week when, once again, I have another marvelous guest like Dr. Pat Gibson. Until then, remember that when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. Talk to you next week.